Stanford University.
Okay, it's great to be here this afternoon, and I should ask at the very outset, how's everyone's reunions going so far? Yeah, great, okay. And hopefully you're all going to make it to the football game this evening. As you know, we have done a great job both of the last 2 weeks and probably would qualify for the last 3 weeks. And I expect to see Stanford continue to extend its winning record again this evening. So as you just heard, I find nothing more interesting than water, maybe because my grandfather used to regale me with stories about the Owens Valley and his view that Los Angeles had stolen his water from him. By the way, he then, after getting the money for the water, because he did get some money for it, he then went down to the San Fernando Valley and subdivided property using the water that Los Angeles was now taking from the Owens Valley down there. So my grandfather was actually pretty smart. But what I want to talk to you about today are droughts. And not just about the California drought, although I'm going to cover that, but in addition to that, droughts around the world and droughts today, past, and into the future. And I want to start actually with the spring of 1862, because the spring of 1862 was the spring of the great Central Valley flood of California. In December of 1861, it rained. In January of 1862, it rained even more. The snow melted early that year, creating a huge flood in the Central Valley of California that at its peak was 20 miles wide and 300 miles long. If you lived in Sacramento at that point in time, as you can see from this particular photograph, you had to take a boat to work. If you wanted to, you could take a boat from San Francisco all the way to Bakersfield, because it was all at that particular point in time underwater. What is interesting, however, is that starting with that great flood in the spring of 1862, within a couple of months, California, as well as most of the Western and the United States as a whole, was mired in what has become known as the Great Civil War drought of 1862 to 1865. For something in the nature of about 60 or 70 years, it was the largest drought in the history of the United States. As you can see from this particular photograph, it again impacted not only California, but most of the western United States, as well as a significant portion of the northeastern portion of the state of California. And like most droughts in the history of the United States or the history of the world, it had major impacts on the people who were living at the time. First of all, most historians, I think today, believe that it was a central factor in the demise of the California ranchero. California ranchos at that particular point were land rich, but they were money poor. And they depended upon grapes and cattle for the money to remain in business. During this particular drought, you had hundreds of thousands of cattle that died, and thousands of grapevines that withered. And as a result of that, a lot of the ranchos of this particular period ended up having to sell, and what they ended up doing was generally selling into the hands of dozens or hundreds of people that then broke up those ranchos into smaller portions of land. The Great Civil War drought of 1862 to 1865, also in the view of some historians, was one of the contributing factors to the demise of the United States bison. The bison at this particular point were already hit hard by hunting and various other threats. But what happened during the drought period was that bison in periods of drought survived by traveling down to rivers. But this time, when they traveled down into the valleys and the rivers in order to try to find water, what they found were Indians and white settlers who had come into those valleys before them. And so as a result of that, they were not able to follow their traditional method of surviving drought. So again, this particular drought, maybe the demise of the California ranchero, also maybe the demise of the US bison. And there are some historians that even believe that it was partially responsible for the United States winning the Civil War. In 1863, the Confederates were trying to fight back west of the Appalachians. And in particular, there were three Confederate forces that began in Tennessee. One of those Confederate forces was led by Major General Edmund Kirby Smith, pictured in this particular photograph. They moved north up into Kentucky, and they had initial success. One of the things, in fact, that happened was they had enough success that they were able to install a Confederate governor for the state of Kentucky at that particular point in time. But within a period of about 3 or 4 months, they were dragging back south again to Tennessee. And looking to try to explain what happened to that particular Confederate force, one explanation was that it was the drought. If you read the stories of the soldiers on the Confederate side in this particular campaign, they talk about not finding any potable water to drink. They talk about dust storms that enveloped them. And they also talk about the fact that they were running out of food. And in fact, in 1863 in the South, Georgia was the only state that had a normal crop yield, because all of the various other states were, again, suffering from the Great Civil War drought of 1862 to 1865. So several messages to take home from this particular drought. The first one is droughts have severe impacts. And second of all, you can find droughts immediately next to floods. In the case of the Great Civil War drought of 1862 to 1865, you started with a flood and then got a drought. This time around, we might very well find that we started with a drought and end up with some severe floods this year because of El Nino. And frequently you find floods right in the middle of droughts, where you start out with a drought, you end up with a year or two of floods, but that never helps you totally recover, and then you go right back into a drought period again. Of course, the Great Civil War drought of 1862 to 1865 was not the last drought that we have suffered in California or in the United States. We still consider the worst drought in the history of the United States to have been the Dust Bowl drought that began in 1830 and lasted for that entire decade. And actually, it's a series of 4 droughts. You would have a drought for about 1 or 2 years, then you would have a rainy period, but it never rained enough to make up for the drought period that lasted before, and things got worse and worse. And although the drought that lasted during the Dust Bowl focused on the Great Plains, it also hit California and most of the western United States very hard. And I'm sorry, 19. Thank you, Bill. So 1930 to 1939. So as you can see from this particular slide, again, we are not in any way strangers to droughts in the western United States or the United States as a whole. What this particular slide shows is the percentage of the United States that is enveloped in a particular drought. And so you'll see here is the Dust Bowl drought of the 1930s. But you also have, in addition to that, the drought that we had back in 1975 to 1976 here in California. That, as you see, was not just a California drought. It enveloped much of the United States. Similarly, we had a major drought here in California, but also much of the United States in that 1987 to 1993 period of time. So we're not strangers to drought here in California, but we're also not strangers to drought in the United States as a whole. And of course, droughts are not limited just to the United States. Just to take some recent droughts that hit countries very hard, you have the Australia Millennium Drought of 1995 to 2009. This is the worst drought that Australia has experienced since white settlers came to Australia. And in fact, it was so severe at one point in time that major cities in Australia banned all outdoor irrigation. The only water you could use was indoors. So the next time you're in a drought here in California or the United States and you're told you can only water your lawn twice a week, think about Australians that were never permitted to water their lawns. There was also a severe drought in Syria from 2006 to 2010 that, again, some people believe helped to contribute to the civil war which is currently enveloping Syria, because this particular drought led 1.5 million people to move from the countryside, where they could no longer grow crops, into the cities. And when they got to the cities, they were basically met with indifference. In addition to the Syria drought, of course, we have today the Great California Drought of 2012, till you tell me when it is likely to end. This particular drought has been largely caused by this particular phenomenon, something that a graduate student here at Stanford dubbed the ridiculously resilient ridge, which is this ridge of high pressure, very large ridge that has sat off of the northwest coast of the United States and basically has prevented the normal Alaskan Arctic storms that come down and sweep down through California. They have prevented those storms from coming down here, and instead they've basically sort of bounced off of that, moved over into the Midwest area, and led to very cold and stormy winters in the Midwest and the eastern United States. This is the most recent drought map of the United States, and you can see why we are suffering, particularly in California. We have a very severe drought throughout much of the state. But again, looking at this particular map, recognize that the drought is not simply a drought in California, it's also a drought in the Pacific Northwest, much of the Southwest, in Texas, and there are areas throughout the United States that are in lesser droughts. And as USA Today mentioned earlier this year in a major article that they wrote about droughts, although the California drought is the worst drought that we've seen in 40 years, we're also experiencing very severe droughts elsewhere in the world. So Brazil is probably in their worst drought in 50 years, and Sao Paulo just announced that it was declaring a drought emergency and that they no longer promise to provide water to everybody who has water rights in the area. South Africa is in the midst of a two-decade drought and again has declared an emergency. We think that North Korea is in probably the worst drought that they've seen in 100 years, but given the secrecy of North Korea, we're not absolutely sure about that particular fact. And the most recent drought that has taken place more recently than that USA Today article, and therefore was not listed, is a major drought in Eastern Africa. It appears to be related to the El Nino effect. The El Nino effect brings a lot of rain to the western United States, but it also generally brings drought to the eastern portion of Africa. This is a picture from the New York Times earlier last week. And Ethiopia, as well as most of the countries on the eastern part of Africa down to Kenya and Tanzania, look like they are going to have a very severe drought for the next year. And the problem there is that there's very little that they can do about that. They don't have the foreign currency necessary right now to import the food that they need in order to replace the food that they will not be able to grow, and this is a potential disaster in the making. But one of the things that's important to recognize is this particular picture of cornfields in the United States show droughts of any nature in any place have a severe economic impact. In fact, according to scientists, according to United Nations studies, droughts today are the most severe natural disaster that we encounter. There is more money lost as a result of droughts around the world each year than any other type of natural disaster that we encounter. The difference between droughts and other forms of natural disasters, however, is that natural disasters are a slow-moving disaster, right? They come on looking relatively mild and just get worse and worse as they go along. So they look very different from floods, from tsunamis, from earthquakes, but they are actually much more severe. On an average basis, each year, we lose about $6 to $8 billion in income in the United States as a result of droughts, primarily because of their impact on agriculture. And one of our concerns today is that the droughts that we're seeing today in the United States might actually be relatively mild compared to what we have seen in the past. This particular drawing is from the San Jose Mercury. And the important thing to recognize here, what this shows up here is the percentage of the United States that is in drought, right? So 0% to 100%. As you can see, in sort of an average year, you have something in the nature of about 38% of the United States that is in drought. However, if you go back, and this is paleological climate information, if you actually go back to the period from about 900 AD until something in the nature of about 1100 AD, you actually see that droughts were much more severe back then than they are today. And in fact, one of the things that we can see by going and looking at paleoclimate information at this particular point in time is that although today droughts tend to last no more than about 5 years, maybe 7 years at the greatest, back then we had droughts that would sometimes last 13 to 14-year periods of time. Even more distressing, there were periods where for one maximum of about 140 years, we were hit by one drought after another, so that although you did get rainfall during that 140-year period of time, and you did get some years in which you had above average rainfall, those above average years never made up for the drought years that had preceded them. And we know this because, for example, in Mono Lake in the Owens Valley, you can actually find tree stumps growing in the middle of Mono Lake. And there's no way that they could have actually taken root unless the lake at that particular point in time had largely dried up because, again, of these very lengthy periods of time when even though every year was not a drought year, over time things were getting worse and worse. The other thing is if you just look more recently, again, at the percentage of the United States in drought, you see what appears to be a steadily increasing percentage of the United States that is in drought, although I should rush to say in that particular case that's a small enough trend in this particular case that it's not clear whether or not the drought percentages are actually increasing over that period. Climate models, though, suggest that, again, droughts will probably get worse in the future than they are today. So climate models are still quite rough. Depending on the particular model you'll look at, they will sometimes predict very different things. One thing that we really can't predict very well right now based on climate models is how much precipitation we're likely to receive in the future compared to today. There's some models that suggest we will get more precipitation in the future. There are others that suggest there will be less precipitation. But what virtually all of the models suggest is we're going to have more extreme conditions. So that whether or not rain on average goes up or down, that we will actually have more droughts and those droughts will become more extreme. So what this particular set of maps shows, at the very top, those two maps are based on climate models that suggest things are going to get wetter in the future. These maps down here are based on the assumption that we're going to see drier climate in the future. And then what they look at is these two maps look at whether or not we will have more months over a 30-year period of time that we are stuck in a drought compared to today, with these two sets of maps looking at droughts defined purely on the basis of precipitation. And then these two maps over here do exactly the same thing, except they define droughts based both on precipitation and also on soil moisture. And so if you just look, for example, up here at what is assumed to be a relatively wet period, whether you define drought in terms of precipitation or precipitation plus soil moisture, what you see is that we are likely to have many more months of drought and more severe months of drought than we do today. And of course, if you assume a drier United States, then that drought tendency envelops much more of the United States. And if you look again at climate models looking into the future for the world as a whole, and I'm not going to go into the details of these particular maps, but these maps again ask the question, are we going to see more droughts and more severe droughts in the future than we are today? And the thing to recognize on these particular maps is if you have a warm color, if you have yellow or if you have red, then that is more severe droughts and more frequent droughts in the future. And as you can see, virtually worldwide, we are likely to have more severe droughts. So what I want to talk to you about for the remainder of my time today is, well, what can we do about this? How can we make our water systems more resilient than they have been in the past? And there are two things that we have control over. We have control over demand for water, and we have control over the total amount of water which is available. I'm going to focus over here. I'm going to focus on how we can actually perhaps increase our supply. So without necessarily having to conserve more water, we might actually be able to be more resilient in the face of drought. But in talking about the supply side, I don't want to forget the demand side. Because the truth of the matter is that historically, particularly in a state like California, we've gotten by conserving. And we've been lucky because we actually have had a lot of slippage in the system. We have a lot of what some of my colleagues call ornamental water that we use on a regular basis that in drought years we can readily get by without that particular water. And so as a result, we do still need to be thinking about conservation. And we can encourage conservation by both telling people the importance of conserving during a period of drought, as well as raising prices and ensuring that those price incentives encourage people to conserve water. But again, I'm not going to talk about the demand side. I want to talk about the supply side. And when we talk about the supply side, I think there are three basic strategies that we need to be looking at globally. And I've abbreviated it in terms of DSI. Okay? D is for diversify. We need to diversify the water sources that any particular region enjoys. Second of all, we need to store water when water is available in those wet years so that it is available at least the beginning of a drought period. And finally, we can immunize ourselves from drought by developing water sources that themselves are immune from droughts. So I just want to walk through each of these, and so I will start with diversification. In California, we actually are in pretty good shape in the case of most droughts. And that's because over time we have developed one of the most sophisticated water systems anywhere on the face of the planet. And many of our cities have very diverse water supplies. So if you come from the LA region down in here, and how many people in the room are from Los Angeles? Okay, so a fair number of you are from Los Angeles. And as you probably know, you not only have a local water supply, but you also are bringing water down from my grandfather's old property in the Owens Valley down to Los Angeles, right? You're also bringing water over from the Colorado River, water that otherwise, for those of you who are from Arizona, might be used in Arizona or Colorado. And then finally, you are basically stealing all the water from those of us in Northern California and bringing it down through the State Water Project to Los Angeles, okay? So if you are on the Northern California, Arizona, or Owens Valley end of that particular equation, you might not like this, but from a Los Angeles standpoint, it puts you in a great position because it's unlikely in any particular year that the drought will envelop all of those various sources. So you're able to survive a lot of droughts because even though one of your sources might be hit, other sources are not. On the other hand, if you're from Santa Cruz, who here is from Santa Cruz? Any Santa Cruz? Okay, a few people from Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz, you're really out of luck because Santa Cruz basically has one source of water. So in this particular drought, Los Angeles has been in much better shape than Santa Cruz, and it's because it's had the luxury of diversifying its water supply. Once you put in this type of infrastructure, by the way, you also can engage in water marketing. If you're Los Angeles and you're in a drought period, you can turn, for example, to farmers or other areas of California, and you can see whether or not somebody might be interested in actually selling you some water. And Los Angeles, for example, has a whole series of what are known as dry year option contracts, under which they have pre-agreed with farmers that those farmers will give up some water to Los Angeles during periods of drought. This particular chart, what the bars show is the total number of acre feet of water which is moving through our California market system in any general year. The areas in brown here are the areas of drought years, and one of the things you'll see is that in most drought years, the amount of water marketing actually goes up. And again, that's because those areas that are short of supplies during drought periods will look elsewhere and will buy that water. Now, one of the problems, of course, is for a lot of areas of the world, it's just too expensive to do what Los Angeles has done, or what much of the United States has done, which is to build aqueducts to distant water supplies and bring them in. So what do you do, for example, if you are these Ethiopian farmers? Well, there is one source of water that you might be able to turn to diversify your water supply and protect yourself a little bit in drought, and that is what these guys are doing, which is turning to groundwater. Groundwater has an advantage of it can both diversify your water supply, so if you don't have enough surface water in a particular year, you can turn to groundwater. And in addition to that, that groundwater does not suffer generally during a period of drought. That groundwater is going to be there in a wet year or in a dry year. And one of the things that scientists, through their research over the last 10 years, have discovered is that there is an immense amount of groundwater underneath Africa. So Africa, as well as much of the world, to diversify its water sources, be able to be more resilient during periods of drought, can turn not only to surface water, but also to groundwater. And what you see here is those blue colors show immense amounts of highly productive groundwater. The dark greens show moderate amounts of groundwater. You can again see how much of Africa may be able to depend upon groundwater. But there's still a problem here. If you are a poor Ethiopian farmer or a poor farmer anywhere in Africa, it's great for me to tell you that there is groundwater underneath your property, but how are you going to pump it out? Because you may not have access to electricity, and electricity for using your pumps can be very expensive. Historically, to get groundwater, a lot of African farmers have basically hooked bicycles up to the pumps and bicycled away in order to pump that water out, but that's also very time consuming. So one of the things that we are looking at now is trying to couple the idea of pumping groundwater with solar power. And there's an organization, the Solar Electric Light Fund, that now is providing solar panels, like you see in this particular picture, to farming communes in Africa. And the power from those particular solar panels is used both to pump the groundwater out of the ground and then distribute it to all of the crops. There, here at Stanford, is a Center for Food Security and the Environment. It's joint between the Woods Institute, which I run, as well as the Freeman Spogli Institute. It has been studying the effectiveness of this particular approach, and what they have found is that it actually increases food security by about 20%. It almost always ensures that the farmers have enough water to meet their basic needs, and it also increases their income. Now, there's only one problem with turning to groundwater, and that is that you can get really used to groundwater. And you can begin to pump too much groundwater out, and pump it out not only during the dry periods, but also during the wet periods. And that's a problem that we are having here in California. So this is a little bit complicated of a graph, but let me just see if I can briefly explain it. Up here is the groundwater table, so the level at which you find groundwater underneath the ground in many portions of the Central Valley. And then I also in a moment going to point out this particular sort of purple line here, which shows what's happening in the Tulare Basin of the Central Valley. Now, much of the Central Valley is managing groundwater the way they should. So in these dry periods, and the white areas are dry periods, what you'll see is that they're drawing down on their groundwater. And that's what you would expect them to do, because that groundwater is making them more resilient in the face of that drought. But then in the wet periods, they're letting the rain replenish these particular aquifers, and their water table is going back up. So this is a sustainable approach to being resilient to droughts. You draw it down when you need to in a period of drought, but then you let it move back up again in the wet period. But look what they're doing again in this purple line, which is the Tulare Basin. What they're doing there is that they are drawing down the water during the dry periods, and that's exactly what they should be doing. But then when you get the wet periods, they're still drawing down the water. They are pumping more water out of those groundwater aquifers than is being replenished during that period of time. And that's ultimately an unsustainable practice. And just to give you an example of the sort of problems that this can lead to, just want to tell you the story quickly of the town of Happy, Texas. How many people here are from Texas? Okay, a few people from Texas. Anyone ever been to Happy, Texas? Happy, Texas is down the sort of Lubbock area, and it was known as Happy, Texas, a town without a frown, because it had great spring water. It had so much groundwater that back in the 19th century, when you had cattle drives coming through, they knew that there would always be water in this particular area. The town of Happy, Texas used that groundwater to build up a really very prominent agricultural economy. So in the town of Happy, Texas, they had 3 Happy diners, they had 2 Happy saloons, they had 3 Happy banks, they had a Happy bakery. But unfortunately, they continued to overdraft the groundwater until they reached a point that the water table became so low that they could no longer afford to pump that water out any longer. And this is what the community of Happy, Texas looks like today. And of all those very happy businesses, the only happy business left is the Happy State Bank. It's the only thriving, well, not thriving, it's the only marginally surviving business left in the town of Happy, Texas. And the problem is that we are overdrafting our groundwater in those wet periods when we shouldn't be, not only in portions of the United States, but many areas of the world. So we're doing it. Here's the High Plains Aquifer, the Ogallala Aquifer. That's what Happy, Texas drained down in their particular area. But India and Pakistan have also been draining down their groundwater because they've become highly reliant upon it. And in northern China, we're drawing down on the amount of groundwater that's available. And those are simply the major examples of groundwater overdrafting. So groundwater is one way of diversifying your water sources, but you have to be very careful about how much groundwater you use, lest you use it up. Okay, so that was the first of the various strategies. The second strategy is to store water when it's available in wet years so that you have it available during periods of drought. Southern California, again, has resorted to this particular strategy. This is one of the most recent storage reservoirs in Southern California, the Diamond Valley Lake. And it's another reason why Southern California did very well in the early days of this particular drought, because they had stored the water that they needed for a period of drought. They were like that pig that built his house out of bricks rather than out of straw. There are other areas of the world that are also resorting to this particular strategy, and not simply in developed areas of the world. So this is a picture of the Katse Dam in Lesotho, which is one of the major projects that South Africa has embarked upon in order to ensure that they are more drought resistant. The problem, though, is that if you look at where we've built our major reservoirs and dams in the United States, we're doing very well in North America. Here in California, if you take all of the storage capacity we have behind our reservoirs, it stores enough water for about 1 1/3 years of our water use. So that means when we go into a drought, if it stops raining, we can still survive for 1 1/3 years, which is actually doing extremely well. But if you can see from this particular picture, other areas like Thailand, Mexico, and South Africa, the y-axis in this particular case measures the total amount stored per capita, right? So these are comparable figures, and what you will see is that South Africans are storing much less per capita than we are in North America. Here's a map that shows where our major reservoirs and dams are around the world. And again, not surprisingly, they're primarily in North America and in developed areas of the world. You don't see that many in Africa and South America. And as you can see from this particular graph here, what this shows is the number of dams and the total volume of storage capacity over time starting in 1880 until 2000. You can see we went into this one period where we just built dam after dam after dam, but we have stopped doing that to a large degree. This is the same chart, but it actually goes out until just 2 years ago. And again, you can see basically that we have stopped expanding the number of dams around the United States. There are a variety of reasons for that. Dams are harder to build today because environmentalists will oppose virtually any dam that is built. In addition to that, we have used some of our best dam sites around the world, so the sites that are left hold less water. And third of all, dams turn out to be very expensive. There's another problem also, which is, again, because we have used up some of the best dam sites, if we build new dams, they don't necessarily get us very much. Probably a number of you who are from California voted for Proposition 1 last year, which provided a lot of money for building new dams in California. If you take the major dams that we are thinking about building under Prop 1, it will increase the total amount of storage that we have in California by about 7%, and that will actually increase our water supply by only about 1%. The other thing to recognize about storage is that storage only helps you at the beginning of a drought. If it remains dry, it doesn't help you very much because you can't fill up your reservoir again and have that water that would be available later in the particular drought. One thought, if we are going to go the storage route, and I think it's really important, rather than storing water in our surface reservoirs, another possibility is to use groundwater aquifers. And those groundwater aquifers, particularly some of those groundwater aquifers which we have overdrafted in the past, have some storage capacity in them. And it's actually much cheaper to store water underground in these underground aquifers than it is in surface reservoirs. Sometimes it's 90% less expensive to store water underground than it is in surface reservoirs. So we should be thinking about storing, but again, storing not only on the surface, but also underground. Okay, the final thing I want to talk about is the idea of immunizing ourselves from drought. And here the idea is can we find some water supplies that are basically immune from droughts? Even if you have a drought, that water supply remains relatively robust. And the answer is that there are, and they depend upon technology. So the first one, which again all of you are very familiar with, is recycled water. Recycled water is not always that popular. I'll come back to that in a moment. But recycled water is another source of water. It's another way in which we can diversify our water supplies. And in addition to that, it's relatively drought-proof, right? The recycled water does not disappear when we move into a drought. Here in California, we are recycling water in Orange County. Those of you in Orange County should be proud of yourselves. This is the largest water recycling plant anywhere in the world. In the Monterey area, as you can see from this particular map, we have the largest urban recycled to agriculture system in the world. So we are actually taking the water from the Monterey region, the wastewater from there, recycling it, and then providing it to farmers in the region for agricultural purposes. Recycling, again, is found not just in the United States. The major countries right now engaged in recycling are United States, Australia, and South Africa. This is Durban, South Africa, which in 2011 opened up the first major recycling plant in Africa. As you can see, these are the actual Board of Governors of the Durban Water Supply. They have their glasses of recycled water along with them. Here is one of the safety engineers drinking recycled water in Durban. And I have to ask, only because it's great to have an opportunity to survey a well-educated audience of this nature. If you were in Durban, South Africa, and this gentleman, and I will tell you, he has a PhD, he's highly educated, and this is an exceptionally good recycling system. If he were to go up to you with a glass of water from the Durban recycling system and offer it to you, would you drink it? So how many of you would drink it? Wow, that each year, the percentage of people who say they would drink the water actually goes up from the year before. The bottom line is recycling has a large yuck factor to it. And there are a lot of people who just cannot get over the fact that it was originally wastewater. And one way of really sort of understanding the yuck factor, maybe I don't want to point this out to those of you who just said that you would drink recycled water, but there is a set of experiments that was done once where people took bedpans. And these are fresh bedpans right out of the packaging, so they've never been used before. And they then, in front of the subject of the experimenter pours water into the bedpan, and then pours the water from the bedpan into a glass of water, and then sees whether or not the subject will drink the glass of water. It turns out that virtually no one will drink that particular water, even though we know for sure that that water is as clean as it was when it was poured into the bedpan. So we do face that particular problem. Singapore, as you probably know, is actually the country that has gone most into recycled water. About 30% of all of Singapore's water is now recycled water. And they even invented a brand for their recycled water, which you see here, which is New Water. And all of the tests actually show that the new water that you find in these particular bottles is actually cleaner than all of the other water that the nation of Singapore uses. But nonetheless, even with new water, you find about 50–60% of the population that just cannot bring themselves to drink something that they knew was originally wastewater. Okay, so recycled water, that's one way in which we can make ourselves more resilient. And the other is desalination plants. This is one of my favorite cartoons with the idea that we can combat rising sea levels by simply constructing thousands of desalination plants to take that water back out of the ocean. A brilliant solution, but desal is beginning to see its heyday. Desal is now solidly here in California. This is the new Carlsbad, California plant that will probably go online later this year and will be the largest and the most modern desalination plant in the United States. This is a picture of Israel's Sorek plant, which is the largest and most modern plant anywhere in the world. And again, you find desalination plants in a variety of developing countries. So this is in Mossel Bay, which is again in South Africa. Here's a map that actually shows where water is being desalinated around the world. It probably won't surprise you that Saudi Arabia is engaged in the most desalination. What will probably surprise you is the United States actually desalinates the second most amount of water. There's a little trick in these particular figures. The reason the United States is so high is there's actually two ways in which we use desalination. One is to desalinate ocean water. The other is that if you have brackish groundwater that is salty, then you also can desalinate that in order to utilize it. And the United States is the leading user of desalination for brackish water. But what I want to focus us on again is that although desalination is part of the future, desalination is still very expensive. And recycling water, as I'll show you in a moment, is still very expensive. As a result, you don't see very much desalination or recycling in developing areas of the world. This shows the comparative costs of desalination and recycling compared, for example, this is a figure, if I remember correctly, for San Diego. This is the cost of sort of just local surface water. Look how much more expensive recycling is, and desalination is even more expensive than that. So the reason why we don't see more desalination in California and the United States today of ocean water is just too expensive. It's your last resort. But particularly if you are in a developing country, desalination and recycling is out of your price range. It's coming down. This basically shows the cost of desalinated water starting in Santa Barbara in 1991, going down over time. But what we now know is that this is basically about the plateau of desalination costs. It's not going to come down much more unless we have some significant advances in technology. So what are those advances? The major way in which we desalinate water is through reverse osmosis. We basically push the water through tiny little holes that let the water molecules through but block out the salt molecules. And desalination is very expensive. It takes a lot of energy to do that. As you know, energy is expensive. One of the hopes is that we might be able to find new forms of membranes through which to push that salt water that reduces the amount of energy that we need. And one particular compound that people are very excited about is graphene. It's basically a form of carbon. It is almost two-dimensional. It is that thin, and it is exceptionally strong. And the studies suggest that we may be able to use graphene as the membrane in desalination plants and maybe reduce the cost of desalination by another 30 or 40%. But the thing I'm actually more excited about are the possibilities over on the recycling side. And this is a picture of Stanford faculty and students working on a new recycling technology. This is Craig Criddle, who's a professor of civil and environmental engineering. This is Tom Cantwell, who is a rocket scientist. And they've gotten together, and what they've been looking at is how can you take wastewater and not only get pure drinking water out of it, but also the maximum amount of energy out of it by taking the compounds that are in energy and using Tom Cantwell's expertise in rocket fuel, turn that into energy. And what they have developed is a technology that not only provides you with fresh drinking water, but it also provides a net positive amount of energy. So it provides you with more energy than you actually had to put into the process. Now, this is not a perpetual motion machine, because I know some of you are out there thinking that's impossible. What it does is it actually uses the materials found in the wastewater to produce the energy. Okay, so that's where you're getting the additional energy, is from the wastewater itself. But this particular technology could mean that not only in the United States, but elsewhere around the world, we could actually recycle water on a profitable basis. The other exciting thing about this is that this technology can actually be used at a very small scale. So you can use it on a distributed basis so that in Africa, rather than looking only to use this in large cities, you could also use it on a village level. And right now, Stanford is building the Cotega Resource Recovery Center, which you can see the groundbreaking in this particular picture here, because we are taking this particular technology I just described, as well as some other technologies, and we're going to be testing them here on the Stanford campus. We're going to be scalping Stanford's sewage water. Before it goes to Palo Alto, we're going to take our sewage water out, and then we are going to recycle it and see whether or not we can do that on a profitable basis. Last slide, which is to make this work, though, we have to put a lot more money into water technology than we have historically. What this shows is the number of new patents in the energy field, which is this line, versus the water field, which is this line. We put only a fraction of the money that we put into energy into water. And one of the results of that is that our technological level of innovation in the water field is only a fraction of what it is in the energy field, and we need to do much better than that if we are indeed going to be resilient to droughts in the future. So with that, thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.